Merhaba, hoş geldiniz. Konuşmalarımızın bundan sonraki kısmı İngilizce devam edecek. Dolayısıyla Türkçe simultane tercüme istiyorsanız kulaklık alabilirsiniz dışarıdan. Hoş geldiniz tekrar. Hello, welcome to Istanbul Modern. I'm honored to present the first speaker of Museums Talk from Germany, Dr. Yilmaz Dziewior. Since 2012, we have hosted 20 top museum professionals from the US and the UK within the framework of the Museums Talk from the USA and from the UK. This year we focus on Germany in collaboration with the Goethe Institute, Istanbul. I'd like to acknowledge the invaluable contribution of the Goethe Institute, Istanbul, the team, all the guest speakers who were very kind to accept our invitation to share their ideas and experience with the audiences. In Museums Talk from Germany, we invite museum directors, department directors, and curators to discuss German models of art institutions and the museum as an institution. The talks focus on new modes of museum management, including collections and archives, curatorial practices, architecture and expansion projects, events and communication. And I hope we can achieve our goal through this series. Our goal is to foster the dialogue between the international and local art professionals, with the museum audiences, and even global digital audiences, as we put these videos on the Istanbul Modern YouTube page. Tonight, we welcome a colleague from Cologne, Yilmaz, who is the director of the Museum Ludwig in Germany. In his lecture, Yilmaz discusses his curatorial and managerial experience and practices at the Museum Ludwig that houses some of the most prominent collections in Germany since 1976. The title of his talk is The Museum in the 21st Century, with a question mark, because he will discuss two possible scenarios for the future, an optimistic and a pessimistic one. And I hope we'll have some time to discuss it further with him, because we'd like to discuss the past and the future of the museums together. Well, Yilmaz, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. My thank goes very heartily to the Istanbul Modern and to the Goethe Institute to invite me here. It's great to be in Istanbul. I have to apologize, though my first name is Yilmaz. I don't speak Turkish. My father is Turkish, but I didn't grow up with him, so I didn't catch the language, unfortunately. But I like to be here, and it's great for me to be here, and it's also an awkward experience all the time when I try to come regularly to Istanbul, at least every second year to the biennial. And it's an interesting experience to be sort of like recognized by people as a Turkish person. At least everyone talks Turkish to me, though I don't have, I can't probably answer. The introduction statement I did and you kindly referred to was more like a trigger or a starting point. Also the title, the Museum of the 21st Century, with a question mark, but you know, I don't come here with a formula to say what I'm not a future teller. What the museum will be in the future. What my aim today will be to concentrate on the one hand on the German scene. Also, I try to bring across a little bit the structure of German art institutions, and I will be a bit reductive, to be honest. But I think to make a point clear. And then I also would like to go, and there I brought a lot of images, and I won't comment every image, but I brought really a lot of images with me, and to hopefully visualize what I'm talking about to you without, you know, going into detail into every image I brought along. So talking about the German art system or the exhibition system, if one simplifies, one can categorize three types of institution. Most of you may know. It's the one institution is the so-called Kunstverein. And the Kunstverein, there are over 250 of these institutions in Germany, and they're all over the country, and they vary very differently. Some you may know, the one from Hamburg, from Cologne, or from Frankfurt, from the bigger cities, from Munich. They do an international program, but also a lot of smaller cities have Kunstverein. And the origin of this institution is that usually they were founded in the 19th century as part of the so-called, what you can call, Enlightenment. So these art institutions were invented by citizens who wanted to educate themselves, but also to educate the people in the city and the community, and had a strong wish to educate, to do lectures, to do exhibition, to use art as an understanding, to understand our world. In their time, then in the 19th century, with all the difficulties, with the political difficulties in these times, when Germany was sort of like formating itself, and so these institutions were very important, and they still live up today. So they're still these Kunstvereine. So they have this long tradition going back to the 19th century, and at the same time they are the institutions in the German art field who are most experimental and who show usually the youngest art. So very often artists at the beginning of the career, they show at the Kunstverein first, and later on then maybe in other institutions. So there is this slight contradiction. You have like this whole history, and you have also the idea to working really with young artists and to use formats you may or may not use in a bigger institution or in an institution like a museum. So there we have the Kunstverein. Then the second sort of institution is the Kunsthalle. And you know that even in America they call now institution Kunsthalle. That is an exhibition space, usually a bit bigger than a Kunstverein, usually a bit better funded than a Kunstverein, and also they show sometimes more often more established artists. It's simplifying, but I think you can, that is sort of like how you could divide them. And the Kunsthalle, in opposite of the Kunstverein, usually do not have members. The important thing for the Kunstverein is that they were founded in the 19th century and they gathered members together. So you would become a member of this Kunstverein, and then you would exhibit with them, you would go to the talks and so on. So it was, it has this origin, the Kunstverein, and the Kunsthalle usually is younger, usually don't go necessarily back to the 19th century, and usually has no members and has shows a bit more established artists. And the third category is the museum. And the museum, interestingly enough, very often the museum you encounter now in Germany were developed out of the Kunstverein. I had the pleasure to work for 8 years at the Kunstverein in Hamburg, where I was the director from 2001 to 2008. And for me it was interesting to see that we were showing the most experimental younger positions, but that the museum in the same city came out of this Kunstverein, because when the members of the Kunstverein met in the 19th century, also they were showing each other their collection, what they collected, the art they were interested in. And with this collection they got together, they donated later to the museum, to the institution of the museum. That's how in Hamburg, for example, the big museum in the city was developed. So you see, you have the museum, which of course the main, I would say, the main character for the museum is the collection. That's how it's divided. That's how it differs from the Kunsthalle and also from the Kunstverein. Having said all this, you know by now that it's much more complicated now. You know that the big museums, they have members now. That's since several years. And you know also that in recent times when, or let's say, I would say from the 90s onwards, when contemporary art had become that popular, and I'm talking like really of contemporary art, when it had become that popular, that also the museums, which usually, you know, work with the collection or where the collection is so important, that the museums not only have members, but also show now very contemporary art. It started with museums that they had sort of like the project rooms, but now I think it really, the whole system changed, I would say, at least in the last 10 years. And I'm also being part of this, or I feel myself being part of this change and this division I just made in the three categories. In these days, they're more complicated, and you know, one goes into the other, and to talk about the different institution types becomes more complicated. So what I would concentrate with you now here for the talk is how I would see, you know, a possible, like my approach, a possible approach to the institution, to the institution of art, or to the museum I'm working now in. I had the pleasure actually to work in all three categories. It just happened. I worked in the Kunstverein in Hamburg. Then I worked at the Kunsthaus Bregenz in Austria at the Lake Constance. And now, since 1 year, I'm the director of the Museum Ludwig in Cologne. And that means I'm familiar with all three institutions, and I witnessed this change. I was just briefly saying that the strategies or the way to approach contemporary art has shifted in the three institutions. And I would like to maybe concentrate also on three ways I try to deal with contemporary art, or how my approach to contemporary art is. One is, and that actually goes back to my introduction to this experience, you know, having a Turkish name, and I have a Polish family name. So I always had this experience, people looking at me when I was introduced. Of course, always, I was born in Bonn, in the then capital of Germany. Always when I introduce myself, I have this question automatically, oh, nice name or interesting name, where do you come from? So this idea about a cultural identity or a cultural belonging is something which I grow up with, which is very natural to me. And maybe that is also one reason why, since the beginning actually, since I start working in the contemporary art field, I worked with artists who are concerned with this issue, with these issues of cultural identity, of belonging, of the definition of oneself. And so that is one point, and I try to later on when I go through the examples, and these are the examples I brought along. And I said I'm since 1 year only the director of the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, so most of the examples, except the last one, are from my former work at the Kunsthaus Bregenz. So this question of cultural identity is something I can, you know, read if I look back in my work what I was concerned with. And of course that is not so, you could say, so original, because that is a current issue now in contemporary art for a lot of artists. Every 2 years you have the biennial here in Istanbul, and you could say even in each biennial there are artists who deal with this question. Another one is that is maybe also a personal, I think actually every work one does, also you who are sitting here, every work of course originates from the own person, from their own background, from the social class you come, from the sexual orientation you have, or from the different background you have. I think this of course is very much, does inscribe into the work you do. And it happened that I did my PhD thesis on Mies van der Rohe, on an architect from 20th century. Most of you, I guess, know him. So I was already in my studies concerned and interested not only in visual art, but what I would call the fringes of the art. So architecture, but I'm very much interested in dance, in theater, all contemporary forms of cultural expression. I think influenced me, but I think it also influenced the artist. Most important, I worked with. If I look back, a lot of the artists I worked with, they are interested in the fringe, in architecture, in literature, and very often when you meet or when I meet the artists, we talk much more about the other topics, about the music maybe they are listening to, about the books they're reading, the philosophy, or about current political issues, than necessarily about their work. And this is something I'm concerned also when I think about exhibitions or when I plan exhibitions. That's something which is crucial to me. So you have the cultural identity, and you have the what you could call interdisciplinary approach. And the third one, I think, is connected to the two first ones. It's what I would call cultural reflection or institutional reflection. Some people call it institutional critique. I hesitate because that's too one-sided. I see this description. And also artists who are labeled artists of institutional critique, I know they also have their concerns with this label. So reflecting the institution, and I not only mean the museum or the Kunsthalle, but per se reflecting the institution, the art field you're working in, you know, reflecting the art market, reflecting academia, reflecting, of course, the artists, all what constitutes the art field, to reflect this, to analyze this, and to be very aware in which field you work and how you know how they how they are interwoven. And I brought I will show you several images I worked on, and I wanted to mention also, you know, of course, it was always with the team, as a director, and also when I was curating the exhibition. So two persons I want to mention with the. It was Rudolf Sargmeister, who is the curator at the Kunsthaus Bregenz, who I worked often together, and Eva Birkenstock, also from the Kunsthaus Bregenz, who I worked on the Coop Arena project together. So when I say we, I mean, you know, always the team, and especially these two persons. So when I mentioned one point is to reflect the institution you're working in, and to think, you know, how is this institution defined, what constitutes this institution. And when I started together with Eva Birkenstock at the Kunsthaus Bregenz, we were interested in the structure of this institution also, and we were thinking, you know, to get more information about this institution, we were thinking about the archive, you know, because that's something you go to the archive to find out the history of the institution, especially if you come as a new director or as a new curator. So the archive for someone who works there, especially someone who starts working at an institution, is important. And I think it's also important for you, for the audience, because the archive tells you about the history of the institution, of the society the institution was established in. So we approached our colleagues from the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, Charles Escher and Galit Eilat, and invited them to think with us, you know, about what role does the archive play in the institution. And we developed this project called Living Archive, and I won't go to every work we exhibited there, but I would like you to have a look at this blue structure you see, these blue screens. They were developed by an artist who lives now in Berlin, Katrin Meyer, a German artist. And what I like about this formal setting she did, you could call it architecture, for this presentation was how this setting reflects the idea of the archive, that the archive defines certain rooms, certain areas, but also that the archive is that you can look through, you know, that usually it's like a membrane, you know, it goes back and forth, and in the archive things are also communicating with each other. And I think she found a very poetic and very beautiful way of architecture to reflect this exchange in the archive. So what the project and what Katrin Meyer also did then for this exhibition, that she said, you know, we at this point didn't really have an archive. Of course, we have folders, we had like all the correspondence and things, but we didn't have, for example, a room or a structure like a real archive. And she said, I think you have an archive, she said. And that was, you see here the black, I think it's the thing in the, yeah, here, that was a counter going. And there the institution was selling the catalogs from the exhibition. So what Katrin Meyer did then, she said, you have an archive, your books you're selling, they are sort of like an archive because they contain the part of the history. And she copied pages from the catalogs and put them as poster up there, and all pages sort of like also on a different way reflecting to the idea of research. You see the looking glass there, or to the idea of reading and the idea of archive. And what I thought was really interesting, how the Van Abbe Museum dealt with their collection, how they presented the collection, and you see this here nicely. So this is presenting one work. You have here a piece by Paul McCarthy. You have a portrait of the artist Paul McCarthy, and then you have like certain material from the archive. And there were, and we did this with other, let's see, here you have the same with Robert Indiana, where you have the painting from the collection. You have other logos from the time when this was developed, which maybe influenced or informed this piece. You have a portrait, and you have different material to each work. So you would enter the exhibition space, or you would see the original work. So you would have the, if you want to say so, auratic experience of the art piece. But at the same time, you also have the, you get a context. And for example, at the Francis Bacon, there you see there, with the Francis Bacon, there was also like the press reaction to this painting. There was the contract, how when the work was bought for the museum. So things usually are hidden in the archive, would be exhibited there at the exhibition space, and they would tell you something about the history of the of this piece, a history you would usually not know. You know, usually you would, as a scholar, you would enter the archive, but as a visitor, you don't usually. So I think it's interesting. I thought that was a challenging and very, for me, productive way to work with the collection, to work with the archive, and to bring both in a dialogue for our audience, that they have a different experience with the work. So this is an exhibition I have chosen to present you tonight for different reasons. It's an artist, a Korean artist from Seoul, who divides her time between Seoul and Berlin, Haegyu Yang. And usually the Kunsthaus Bregenz, where I worked before, our aim was also that we would invite artists to do new productions with us. And you will see later the image, or you see here already the image. It's a building, very iconic building by Peter Zumthor, the Swiss architect. And you see the building is quite iconic as so far. You have the glass ceiling, you have the floor, the terrazzo floor, and most of all you have this concrete wall. So no white cube, but like real tough, rough concrete. as walls. And for this building, we always invited artists to do new production. But when we work with Haegyu Yang, who is, what I come back to what I mentioned before, interested also in cultural identity. You know, she reflects, and in her work, her own, you know, coming from Korea and living in Germany for a long time. Her position between the cultures is something I would say is reflected very much in her work. When we invited her, for me it was important that, you know, we do not only show new production, what we usually do, but to show an overview of the work she did so far. And for this, Haegyu Yang developed this architecture, which looks like an origami, right? Like a paper thing you can fold, but made out of. And there we presented really an overview of her work with different media, and she created this this architecture for several reasons. One, also to have more space to exhibit works, you know, to have rooms and to exhibit, but also because we were showing films and pieces by her which needed less light. So that was also, that's why she developed this thing. So what our audience would encounter, they would encounter sort of like an overview of this artist, though expecting what we usually do. We do usually new production, so they will encounter this, and then they would come and see this incredible installation. That's what Haegyu Yang is very well known for. Maybe you remember the last documenta by Caroline Christoph Bagariev. There was at the station, at the old station where the trains are, there were the same blinds that would go up and down. And so what she did here was this, what she called cittadella, almost like an architecture also, out of these blinds, and then with the lights going. So it was very, you would immerse into this piece, and there was also actually smell. There were little, you see here, this little these things that were more in the space. They would give out scents from time to time. So you would also have very faint, though. You would have like this idea of beautiful smell. You would have the light going around there. So it was a very sensual experience when you would come into the space. And then on the third floor, she did these works where she combines these racks for clothes with different found materials. Also, you see here with blinds, but also with plastic flowers, with this lamps. And what was interesting, that you would experience these sculptures, they would get something very like humans or like creatures. You would have the idea, and that's also something she was interested in, that they were almost like dancers in this space, like different. And that's also, of course, because of the things here, that they gave the impression they could move and stand somewhere else. And she actually exaggerated this idea of the creature or of the moving dancer, that twice a day the light would go out, and then only the lamps would shine in the dark, and then there would be Sacre de Printemps, the famous piece by Stravinsky, very emotional classical music piece, which was created for ballet, for dance. So she was really playing with this idea of, you know, like this idea that they could move in space. Things I did not mention now. Of course, she was playing with exoticizing figures. If you look at these figures, I don't know if they come across but they look sort of like tropical, or they would give you this idea about a different culture, so to say. That was something she was also concerned or interested in these pieces. or also these wigs here, which became something very much like carnival, for example. I mentioned that one thread I was interested in this for this institution, and I also still am for the Museum Ludwig, is this idea about, you know, not about, yeah, to call it maybe interdisciplinary, or the idea about what is classified as visual art and what is something else. What is theater? What is architecture? And where is the difference between it? You could say, who cares, you know, but as an institution you do all the time, and also you're sitting here, you classify all the time when you see, and that's something in cultural production what I'm very much interested in. So what we and I think this project is a good example for this. It's actually done by Milo Rau. He's a theater person, a director for theater, and he did a play about the genocide in Africa between the Hutsis and the Tutsis, the different people to, you know, really actually, like, it was a real genocide. And the important thing, or an interesting characteristic thing for this historical event, was that one radio station played a certain role. And this radio station was playing like current music then, like hip-hop, for example, but using this music to make the fight more fierce, or to really as propaganda, actually. And it was very disturbing, because it was a very, if you want to say so, hip propaganda. Or it was something very popular culture was used for this. And so what Milo Rau did, and what he always does when he works with theater, he first does research, get all the material he needs for certain historical events. Then he restage this event, sometimes with people who really are involved. That was the case here. But then he develops, out of the material he has, he develops a play. And for us as an art institution, as an institution working with visual art, it was interesting to invite Milo Rau, who definitely belongs to the theater world. He's invited in different to different theaters, who belongs in this world, but to invite him to show his work in our space at the Kunsthaus, and to see what happens if you do this. How, because it's also, I think, a good example of how the context, how the institution defines the production of the work, how it defines the distribution, how it defines the reception. And that's something I'm very much aware. You know, in the 90s it was always that the people were saying, oh, it's so great, you know, architects or visual artists are also designer, and we can have you know, a club in the museum. And I would say I don't think it's that easy. I think if you bring a club into the museum, there is a lot of friction. There's a lot of things going differently, and things change. And I would say, by bringing this theater play into our institution, it also changed, just for this moment. It was later on also on a real stage, but for this presentation with us, it changed also the reception of this play. When you would come into we are open during the day, of course, so if you would come in, you would see this, the stage set, but people who would come in would see this as an installation, right? Not as a stage set necessarily. And we would have two evenings where the play was actually performed. We filmed it, and then later on we projected the play on these blinds, which were then close. So that was something Milo Rau developed for us. So I'm presenting this piece here because it's a good example about also about the conflicts, about what happens if you present one thing from one context in the other, and how this is conflicted, but also how this can be productive, I would say, to get a different awareness of the production. So these are moments from the play. That would be what the people would see then. So one other position I would like to present to you is Wally Export, an artist from Vienna. I guess most of you know her. And here I come back to an issue I was talking about in the beginning, the archive. So when we invited Wally Export to do an exhibition at the Kunsthaus Bregenz, I asked her if she could imagine to present her archive in our museum, and or in our Kunsthalle, and she was surprised and said, "How do you know that I have an archive?" But if you look at her works, you see that certain images even, or certain things appear. Like something from the 70s or even from the 60s would appear in the 90s or in the 80s. And you see sometimes, as I said, the same images. That's something, and when I visited her then to talk with her, I could see there were all the folders in the in her studio basically, and she was working on a sort of like catalog raisonné. But so there was this archive, but of course it was not public. But I think for her work, her archive is really important. So we developed with her together a presentation how we can make her archive visible, and we invited Kühn Malvezzi. These are architects from Vienna, and they have in Vienna and in Berlin their office, to develop a display to present the archive of Wally Export, because our fear was that very easily it can get really boring if you go through an exhibition where you just see all archive material, and that's why we asked Kühn Malvezzi to develop something with us, a display which is also visual attractive, and for our audience that they get drawn into the archive of Wally Export. And that's what they came up with, this different forms of vitrines. This is one of my favorite vitrines, very early, how Wally Export came up with her name. That was it's an artist name, Export. I mean, her name is Waltraud, but everyone was called her Wally. And then she was smoking all the time the cigarette called Export. So she just took her name, Wally, what people were calling her, and that's how her name came. And then she was collecting all the things, different brands with Export, articles, magazine, where she would find the word Export. That was one folder in her archive, and we presented it like this. What for us as an institution was then very interesting, also a bit disturbing in the beginning, that the things we did with her, that a vitrine like this, for example, and also some of the others, not all, but some of the others, we did altogether 57 vitrines. Some they would become pieces by her, they would become an artwork, and they would also be sold on the art market, on the fairs. So that was an interesting experience for me, how the artists, how Wally Export developed through us, through our request, through the institution, transformed parts of her archive into actual works, and then actually also, for example, the Museum Ludwig, we acquired a really beautiful and important vitrine of her work, so that her work, her archive become a work. But that is in the end just logical, because a lot of her works were created out of the archive. So you see, For the ones who don't know Wally Export, she's a very important artist from Austria. She did a lot of performances. She in the 80s she was very well known also as a filmmaker. She was invited to a lot of film festivals. And here, this actually now belongs to the collection of the Museum Ludwig, where I work now. This is, I would say, one of her most famous pieces. What she did, she went. It was 68. She went with this box in front of her body. I was telling she was also very much into film, right, and how film is received. And she's a feminist artist, so we're talking here about 68. So she's the role of the woman in society, especially also in this time, especially in Vienna. She was at this time really one of the very, very few female artists. They were all the Vienna actionism. They were all men. The women were allowed to be the muse, or but they were not being part as the in this. And she was one of the very exception, and that bothered her also. That was a topic for her. And especially the role of the woman in film, but even up to now, if you should tell me a female film director, there are very few. They become more, but in relation to film directors, they're much more, they're less women as film director. And that's something she was concerned and still is concerned. And and what she made art history, one would say, with this piece. So she would go on a public street, on the main shopping street here, Istiklal maybe. So on the main shopping street, she would go with this box in front of her body. She wouldn't wear anything beneath the box, and she would go through the streets and would offer what you would call tap and tast cinema. So you would be allowed to put your hands into the box and touch her body. That she did 68. And the idea behind it, of course, it's very provocative. It's today, maybe it feels also very humorous, but the idea was very clear and very precise. She would thematize with this piece the role of the woman in film, that usually you would come into the cinema, you would look at the films, and the women would appear in the film, but they would be passive. I mean, the viewer would be active looking at the woman, but the woman would have no reaction of course, to the person sitting in the audience. And she said, so she would be passive. And what she said, okay, we still have this situation, but you even have other senses to experience this film. You can use your hands to experience the film, but something which is crucially altered in this reception is that she would look at the people who would, touch her breast, and of course that would alter the whole situation. She would be all of a sudden the person with power. She would be passive as so far as she would be grabbed, but she would define the situation and would have control over the situation. And that was 68. So very important. That is the vitrine I was showing you before also, and that was another. It's nice that we sit here in the cinema, or you sit here in the cinema. That was another piece she did. She did also a lot of experimental films, and she was invited to film festivals at the end of the 60s and 70s. And it bothered her a lot that there were so few, that the roles were so determined, that what the role of the woman, what the role of the man in film industry would be. And what she did, and this is as less spectacular and also now art history, as the piece I showed you before, was that she would wear this trouser. This trouser is actually really from also 68. She would wear this trouser with nothing beneath it. She would be invited as a director to a film festival. What she would do, she would switch on the film. So you would just the projector without film. So you would see the space was dark, the cinema was dark. You would see the white light from the film projector, and then she would go wearing this trouser, would go through the benches, through the seats, you know, one after the other, and would pass by. So, and also here you see the role of the woman in this time really changed. It was again her, you know, reflecting about women in society, and also especially in film at this time. And again, you know, turning around the role and being the active one, and being, in this case, the provocative one. It was funny, you know, when we exhibited the trouser, and these were then later photos she did. She has a machine gun in her hands, but she did this just for the photo, not for the performance. I was a bit naive and was saying, "Oh, Vali, the trouser, that looks still rather new." And she was saying, "Of course, Yilmaz, I only worn it twice, so of course, yeah." But it's from 68. These are posters we have in the vitrine. So we had the archive, and that's something I'm in general interested. I love to do new production with contemporary artists, but I also like to contextualize the artist production. So in the first floor, you had the archive of Vali Export, and then we were also presenting you, some would say, the real thing, so the installations or the photos or the, and this was a big installation where you would see how these things would go into 3 different kind of liquids. These are real electric bulbs. They were really working, and they would go into oil, into water, and into milk. So 3, of course, very loaded, metaphorically very loaded different fluidities. And with this light bulb, they would go in and would come out. And on the wall, you see some of her iconic photo works, and some works she did newly for us. This, what you see here, is long before Cindy Sherman, of course. I mean, that's also 70s when she did this masquerade rolling. This is the famous photo where she wears what she called panic trouser. And yeah, nice title. And on the 3rd floor, there was what she called a forest of films, where we would present, we developed it together with her, where she would present the different films. She did also in the different formats. She did on monitor, 60 millimeters, and I was really happy with this presentation because it gave a good idea about also the different media she was using in film. Here you see different works. So this Vali Export, to show Vali Export in Austria is something maybe very obvious, or I was thinking also. She had several shows already because she is Austrian, but it's maybe an exhibition which sort of like is expected, and which I think also makes totally sense to show a monographic exhibition. But I was telling you about which I showed you with the theater play, and also with the archive we presented before of the Van Abbe Museum, this idea to reflect the institution and the premises and the way institution works, I think became, for me at least, also clear in this piece. We were showing it's what you see here is an installation where we presented a magazine, an art magazine. Some of you may know it. It's called Springerin. It's the Austrian theoretical magazine based in Vienna, maybe similar, or the relation would be to Textkunst in Germany, or maybe October in New York. So like a theory-oriented magazine, and we from the institution shared a lot with this magazine. We were interested in similar discourses which were going on in these in this magazine in Springerin. Even artists we sort of like shared. We had the same interest, let's say, in Vali Export, in Harun Farocki, in different artists. We worked in the institution on the upper 3 floors where we did big solo shows with the mentioned artists. But, and that's what I think is interesting, I was concerned or interested in okay, we have the mutual interest, but how can we profit from each other in the sense of how can our obviously different way of communicating art, of presenting art, how can there be something productive if we join forces or if we develop something together? And this was what you see here. We said, okay, we do one we do an editorial office in our institution, like metaphorically speaking. So we had a lot of talks, we had events, film screenings. We have chosen the topic value, value in the sense of what is idealistic value, but also what is the art market value. Like what is value, a broad topic, I know, but what is value in contemporary art from a philosophical point of view, from artistic production. And we invited artists either to produce new works or to show, or we selected already existing work. And all the talks we had, public talks where we invited scholars to talk about the topic, invited artists, film screening, all this what happened then would in the end come into the magazine, published into the magazine, and so we became the, what you see here is you see the different magazines, different issues, and the artworks dealing with this question. So this is something how the magazine presents itself, and in the end, the institution represented the ideas, both institution in the magazine, which was then published after the exhibition. And here you see, and what we wanted with this architecture we installed there, or with this display, to give this the fragmentation of how the magazine, the different chapter maybe in a magazine, to visualize this and to give an idea how the magazine is constituted. And here I come to the last example of the exhibitions in Bregenz, which was then interesting enough, first shown in Bregenz and later at the Museum Ludwig, where I work now. But this was when I didn't know that I would once become the director of the Museum Ludwig. Here it's maybe something similar like the theater I was talking before, but it's on all three floors. We invited Yvonne Rainer, or we approached Yvonne Rainer, the famous choreographer and dancer, and asked her we would like to do an exhibition with her. And as I mentioned, she's a famous choreographer, dancer, very active. I mean, still today active with almost 80 years now, still today producing new pieces. But as an art historian, she's like a key figure in the 60s, 70s. She worked together with Robert Morris, with Rauschenberg, with Jasper Jones. So she was a interesting figure in art history, in visual art history. But she always insists, and I totally understand her, that she's not a visual artist, but she's a choreographer and dancer, and for a certain period also was a very well-known filmmaker, like cinema filmmaker. So I did this exhibition together with Barbara Engelbach, who is now my colleague in Cologne. So we were thinking, what are the challenges? Some are obvious, right? How can we present Yvonne Rainer, who we think, or not only we, but who in art history is known as a key figure for 20th century art? How can we present this choreographer, this filmmaker, in our institution dealing with visual art? And I'm still not totally convinced with what we did. I don't have, up to now, I can't come up with a better idea. But because what we did, we showed her newest production as a big, as you see here, as a big video projection. It was almost life-size. There were the two newest dance productions she did. And then one floor up, we were showing material. She gave all her archive into the Getty Foundation. So Barbara Engelbach and I went to the Getty Foundation and selected pieces, selected material, posters, scripts, photos, and presenting it here, sort of like an exhibition. So you could see, you could read the films, the famous dances here with Trisha Brown. And that was one of the very crucial moment for me. This is Yvonne Rainer, and she was dancing Trio A, her most iconic dance, and she was just dancing it actually for us, or for Rudolf Sagmeister and me, you know, just to show it to us. And that was, for me at least, very emotional to see this incredible, important figure doing this, and also to get really a sense how she herself, you know, would present it. And for the ones who don't know her, she is or was so important because in the 60s she was against the spectacle. You know, there was the Society of the Spectacle, the important book, but she was like really in dance against this idea about that performance has to do with the spectacle, that she was negotiating the expectation. You would sit here is someone standing, dancing in front of you, and you would expect like this idea of the that there is something absolutely exceptional, and that your mouth is open and that you're shocked or whatever. She would negotiate this by including everyday movements, for example, into contemporary dance, which now we are used to, but at this time it was a very radical decision. And for us it was interesting that in the beginning Yvonne Rainer was saying, yeah, she likes to be involved in the exhibition. We met her several times, but at a certain point on, she said, you know what, actually I'm a dancer and a choreographer. What for me, what for Yvonne Rainer, she said, what for her is important, she wants to show her newest production. Totally understandable. And so what we did, we invited her to Bregenz, to the theater there, and presented her newest production there. And also what she did, she was super generous. She did several workshops for the local dance community. And when I say local, that means that people from Munich, from Zurich, all from the area, but also from Vorarlberg, the region where the Kunsthaus Bregenz is located. It has a strong dance scene, so she would do the courses, the workshops, and they would all come. That was, for me, as someone running an institution, really important, how to you know, how to communicate with your local audience, or how to engage also your local audience in the program. How can it make sense for them? And she, as I said, was very generous and doing all these workshops. And as a result of this, these are two dancers from Vorarlberg. As a result of this, we were able to perform Trio A with people from our region, but professional dancers, of course, but who did workshops with Yvonne Rainer when she offered it. And so our audience would also get the real, or a part of the real thing, not only the projections I showed you earlier of other pieces, but like the Trio A performed as it should be performed. And on the top floor, we were showing the films she did in the 80s, and also the posters, but you could see there are 8 films altogether, so you could watch each film. Here you could sit down with the ear and could concentrate and watch the movie, and at the same time we had this one space here where we would project more like in a cinema. It was darker, now it looks brighter. We project the film, and here were the films, and you could choose. There was something you could choose which film you want to see, and more experience, but then with other audience, other people who would stand next to you, or you would, like you see here, you would sit on a bench, and really only you or someone next to you would concentrate and watch the film. So this reflection of the institution, how you experience film in a visual art institution, what different ways, how does it differ from the cinema, was something we also negotiated or thematized there. So I'm coming now to the last 3 projects, but which was actually one project. Last year I had the pleasure to be, they call it Commissaire, which is the curator of the Austrian pavilion, and I invited Heimo Zobernick for to exhibit there, and I show you this structure you see here, a black structure, a sculpture you would say if you see it. He developed for this architecture for the Austrian pavilion, and here you see the same structure in the pavilion. You see, right? This is the black monolith. You would see it even through the glass, and you would see it here. This is one big black monolith which would go also to the other side. Here you see, and here that's what you would see from the inside. You would think, oh, a black ceiling, but actually it was much more than a black ceiling, because it was a big black construction, a monolith. And he also installed a black wooden floor. Here you have another way, and this I liked very much because it was almost like gave you the idea of a cinema, like the different images of one film, but also like a catwalk for a fashion show. It really changed the usual atmosphere, because that's how it usually looks. And now you get an idea what Heimo Zobernick did. You know, he installed these wood, as you remember, they were disappeared because they were here the black wooden floor. And of course, these arches would disappear. And you see, if you see this space, you get this, you get a feeling what architecture it is. It is, on the one hand, a modernistic building, a pavilion, but like with this almost historical elements, with this small stairs, with the arches you would usually not find with Mies van der Rohe or with Gropius, like with the modernist architects. And what he did, he changed it into this. But if you didn't know, actually it was really interesting, if you didn't know how the pavilion usually looks, this doesn't look like a big deal. You would go into it and you would just think, oh, a black ceiling and a black floor. But it really transformed the pavilion into something very different. And what he also did, he from the biennial before, the architecture biennial in Venice, there was this garden, and he changed, and he said, he talked to the landscape architects and asked them if they could imagine to work with him together on the design, and change it a little bit, but keep the garden, but make it more like a courthouse by Mies van der Rohe, like only the trees have a very different appeal like it was before. Before it was more like a jungle, a lot of and now he makes it more elegant and also more like as I said, like Mies van der Rohe. And that's how people would inhabit it. And I thought what I liked about this, the contribution of Heimo Zobernick to this pavilion, was how it was site-specific. You can see it's absolutely done for this architecture, but it also was on an abstract way site-specific because it reacted to the situation of the biennial in Venice. As you know, in Venice with the national pavilions, it's a lot about economics of attention. Everyone there wants your attention. Every pavilion wants to be the best. It's sort of like a competition. They would even get a golden lion for the best pavilion. That means he reacted to this by not even trying to compete with someone else, not even trying to be anyhow really spectacle, but really slowed down the mood. You would enter it, and that's what for him it was important to change the climate, really the physical climate. And when you would enter this and you see people were hanging out there for, I had like at least 1 hour. I was sitting there with Hans Hake, who came by, and we were chatting. So you would sit there. It was calm. Some people said if we would have an acoustic installation there, because you could hear the birds singing in the garden. It was incredible. It was like really changing this whole situation for this pavilion in Venice for this event. So as I said, I liked very much that it was so site-specific, but knowing the work of Heimut Sobernik quite well, I also asked him if he could imagine to show this very site-specific work in a different context. And when I was doing the biennial in Venice, the Austrian pavilion there, I was still the director. Here you see the Kunsthaus from the outside. Here, that's the Kunsthaus. I asked him if he could imagine, to show this site-specific piece in the Kunsthaus. And he did one black big ball in front of it, relating to the shape you see here, to the shape of the Kunsthaus, or to the dimension, I should say. But then what he did, he transformed. He installed the same black top he had in Venice. He installed it in at the Kunsthaus, and you see these holes here. Can you imagine what they are from? Where the arches were, from the pillars. So he did the same installation, but of course here it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into the architecture. And what happens then? And that's, I think, is really interesting. Let me see. What happens? It becomes a sculpture. It's becomes something you realize. You're confronted. You see it. You don't think about a ceiling. You feel that it's an object. You feel it's an object which doesn't fit into this context, which doesn't fit into the into this building. And actually, the starting point for Venice was this sculpture. Heimut Sobernik produced a bronze sculpture, the first time that he did something like this. So he produced this sculpture, and in the end decided not to show it in Venice, because you've seen the pavilion now. If anywhere there this sculpture would have stand, everyone would just run to the sculpture, do a photo of it, or it would be, you would forget about the really important thing. So I totally understood that he said, oh, for Venice we won't show it. But here, where you have a sculpture anyway, where it's not a site-specific installation, but you have the black sculpture, I thought it was a wise decision from him to show the sculpture in the space. Here you see very well, right, what in Venice you could maybe see a bit through the glass. You see here, and it was a interesting experience, because here there was, like in Venice, there was a shade. It was dark and a different light than here where the sculpture is. And you would really experience as a sculpture. And now, and this I'm coming to an end, now working at a museum, I thought it's interesting, but it's in the logic also of the work of Heimut Sobernik. I thought it's interesting to have something which was done for the format of a biennial in Venice. Afterwards, it was as a Kunsthalle, as I described earlier, as a exhibition space. And what happens now, and how will the artist react with this piece if you present it at a third venue at a museum, where I work now at the Museum Ludwig? And he did basically the same from a strategy, artistic strategy, as he did in Bregenz. He put the black monolith into the building where it didn't fit, into the rooms where it didn't fit. You see, it's much too big. Here you see, yeah, there's hardly any space for the audience to walk on. He put it, but he lowered it from the ceiling and put it on the floor, so it becomes a pedestal, or it becomes a scenery and that makes it for me also really crucial for the sculptures from our collection, because I mentioned earlier the museum, as I see it, is strongly defined by the collection in opposite to the Kunsthalle or other institutions. So he have chosen sculptures from our collection to present it on his sculpture. That was really really nice. I thought it's still on actually. I think it's really nice to see what sculpture he has chosen. You see here the Picasso owl, then the Renaissance piece, the Isagensken chair, the Claes Oldenburg sink. So from different artists, from figurative artists, from conceptual artists, male, female, an overview almost on sculpture in 20th century, a Mayol, the woman. And really, I don't know if it comes across, but you would walk here, you know, you would see this, you know, you've seen the entrance. Oh no, I go the wrong direction. Here, you would see the entrance, you know, and there you would see the Renaissance. And this is really like the Kolbe sculpture at the Mies van der Rohe pavilion in Barcelona, you know, the famous sculpture. And he takes the Renaissance from our collection, and it has the same appeal. And then, so then you would walk in here. You could go in this way. And here, this is, for example, a combination. As an art historian, I would not dare, or I would feel awkward to have the Ullmann bird with it's an owl, but let's say with a bird from Picasso. Of course, I mean, that's, you wouldn't as an art, but I think it is actually productive. It is interesting, for me at least. Interesting questions arise out of this combination, which you usually would not do. And then, yeah, then you would go around here, about here. Then you would go there, and then you would encounter this lady here. And what I want to say, he's also really humorous. Then when you see it, and then what you see here, these holes, they're the same holes you know already from Bregenz and the ones where the pillars were in. But as he put it upside down on the floor, and he put in, it's not a Chamberlain, what may people think, but it's a César sculpture, this pressed automobile. And of course it looked in the space as it would have been pressed to fit in to the space. And then from the other side, you would have the Mario Marini, and then the last image I like to show you, the Luce Fontana, in the dead end of this installation. So I hope what I brought across, that is like the institution as an institution to deal with this, first of all with the artists, you know, and the demand, and what the artist expects, if you work with living artists, expects from the institution, or how it can use it, how the institution can make the conversation between, or the action between, interaction between the artists productive by, as an example, bringing the archive into light, into the audience, by negotiating with the artist the format, what makes sense to do in each institution, and by this addressing the issues the artists, for the artists is crucial, and also of course for our audience, how we engaged with our audience. Thank you very much. So if there are questions, either in English, or I have this here, then it would be translated to me in Turkish. Sorry, I think it was a bit long, but yeah, well, 1 hour 15. If there are no questions, yeah, there are, yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I read your statement in the museum website, which says that you will focus on the architecture, dominating thread of architecture in the museum. So could you say something about it? Because generally you pointed out the exhibition and model. That was very useful, but
Right. I mean, this the last project I showed you. One could argue it would be wrong, but one could say it's all about the architecture. In this case, the architecture of the Austrian Pavilion in Venice, and how something which fits there doesn't fit into our architecture, which is by a different artist. But I concentrated now on this project. I could have shown much more or different. For example, we worked with Raumlabor Berlin. We did in Bregenz. We developed something together. At the moment, for the Museum Ludwig, I'm working with Kühn Malvezzi from Berlin, and we from time to time work with architects, but it's not that. I mean, for me, always working with architects or with architecture, it comes from the logic of the visual arts, because that's where I'm working in, and to make it fruitful to work with architects in this realm, because they maybe have similar issues they have to talk about, and then maybe it makes change to have a conversation, that means an exhibition or a presentation or a talk in our institution, because we as an institution, and our audience who come to our institution share issues with the architects we work with. But the same goes for, as I said, with choreography, with dancer. The same goes for people working in film. But don't get me wrong, we always see it from the point of visual arts, from our institution and from our audience.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I will be a bit longer here also if you don't want to. I know some people don't like to ask in the audience. You can also come then to me and ask me. Or is there a question now? Okay, then. Thank you very much. Thank you.